At 3:15 in the afternoon on February 10, 1944, near Anzio, Italy, the canvas wall of an American field hospital moved like it had taken a breath. For 1 second, there was only the ordinary sound of a wartime hospital trying to stay alive. Metal instruments touching enamel trays, boots pressing into mud, a stretcher pole scraping against a tent peg, a man groaning through morphine, someone asking for more plasma in a voice that was too tired to sound urgent. Then the first shell landed. It did not land far away, where artillery usually became a sound more than an event. It came close enough to lift dirt into the air and throw it against the tent like handfuls of gravel. The ground shook under the cots. A lamp swung once, then again. Somewhere outside, a man shouted, and the shout was cut off by the second explosion. Inside the ward, wounded soldiers who had already survived the front line tried to rise from their beds. Some could not. They had bandages across their chests, drains in their wounds, legs wrapped in splints, hands fixed in gauze. A few had come from the line only hours earlier, still carrying mud from the battlefield on their boots and the smell of explosives in their clothing. They had believed that reaching the hospital meant reaching the rear. Not safety exactly. No one in Italy believed in safety anymore. But at least distance. At least a place where rifles were not pointing at them and shells were not hunting them. But the rear had disappeared. A nurse moved between the cots with her helmet low on her head. Her uniform was not clean. No one's was. Mud had dried on the hem. Her sleeves were rolled just enough to work, not enough to look comfortable. She could hear fragments striking somewhere outside, small, hard sounds like a handful of nails thrown against metal. Men began calling for help. Some called for medics. Some called for mothers. One man only repeated the same sentence over and over, asking whether he was hit again. The nurse did not answer all of them. There was no time. She bent over the nearest patient and told him to stay down. Not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly enough that he obeyed. Another shell hit. The hospital lights flickered. For a moment, every face became a pale shape under the canvas, half seen, half lost in dust. A surgical team in another tent kept working because the man on the table could not be paused. There was no clean break between medicine and battle now. There was only a wounded body, an open wound, a shaking lamp, and the knowledge that if the staff stopped, the patient would die whether the German shell hit him or not. Outside, Anzio was supposed to be an Allied bridgehead. On paper, it was a bold landing behind German lines, a move meant to unlock the road to Rome. But maps had made the coast look wider than it felt. Orders had made time sound more generous than it was. The planners had imagined movement inland, pressure on the German defenses, a thrust that would break the stalemate. What really happened was a trap made of sea, mud, artillery, and delay. The Allied force landed. The German response hardened. The beachhead stopped expanding fast enough. And everything that followed, ammunition dumps, command posts, ambulances, kitchens, hospitals, remained trapped inside a killing ground. The nurses at Anzio were not supposed to be remembered as frontline figures. They did not carry rifles. They did not storm hills. They did not appear in the clean language of tactical maps, where arrows advanced and divisions shifted and casualties became numbers in columns. But war does not always reveal its truth where generals expect it. Sometimes it reveals it beside a cot, when a nurse has one hand on a wounded man's shoulder and the other reaching for a blanket while shells are still falling. That afternoon, the old belief was simple. A hospital was where battle ended. But at Anzio, battle came through the walls. And when it did, the wounded learned something before many commanders did. The line between life and death was no longer only held by infantry, artillery, or armor. It was held by women in muddy boots, working under canvas, lowering patients to the ground, keeping panic out of their voices because panic could kill almost as quickly as shrapnel. The shelling would end. The silence afterward would be worse. Because when the dust settled, the army would have to ask a question it had not truly wanted to face. If the hospital was no longer behind the front, then what exactly were the nurses now? The landing that was supposed to break Italy open. Before Anzio became a word whispered through hospital tents, it began as an idea on a map. clean idea. The kind that looks almost obvious when viewed from a room with polished tables, sharpened pencils, and officers leaning over colored lines. The Allied armies were fighting their way up Italy, but the German defenses south of Rome had turned the campaign into something slow and punishing. Mountains, rivers, rain, mines, artillery, and prepared positions had turned every mile into a transaction paid for with men. So the solution seemed daring. Land behind the German line. Put troops at Anzio, on the coast south of Rome. Force the Germans to react. Threaten their rear. Break the pressure at the Gustav line. Open the road north. Make movement possible again. What they believed was not foolish. That is important. War is not only shaped by stupid decisions. It is often shaped by reasonable assumptions that meet unreasonable terrain. Anzio looked close to Rome. On the map, the distance was tempting. The beaches offered a way around the mountains. Surprise seemed possible. Naval power could protect the landing. Aircraft could cover the skies. Engineers could bring in roads, fuel, ammunition, hospitals, and supplies. If the force moved quickly enough, German command would be caught off balance. But a map does not show hesitation in the human body. It does not show how long it takes for a commander to decide whether the enemy is weak or waiting. It does not show the time lost in uncertainty. It does not show the way a beachhead can shrink inside the mind when every road inland feels watched. Every field may be mined, and every cluster of buildings might hide an anti-tank gun. On January 22, 1944, Allied troops came ashore at Anzio and Nettuno. The landing itself achieved surprise. For a moment, the door seemed open. But doors in war rarely stay open for long. German commanders reacted with speed. Units were pulled, redirected, rushed into position. Artillery found firing points. Observation posts watched the flat coastal ground. The high ground inland became a German advantage, and the Allied beachhead became something more dangerous than a landing zone. It became a bowl. Inside that bowl, everything had to function. The front had to be supplied. Ammunition had to move. Trucks had to avoid shell holes. Engineers had to repair roads that were being destroyed almost as quickly as they were used. Signal lines had to be laid and relayed. Wounded men had to come back through the same crowded routes that fresh troops and supplies were using to go forward. And the hospitals had to be built somewhere. This is where the belief began to crack. A hospital behind a stable front can be placed with some confidence. It can be protected by distance, by camouflage, by marked medical status, by the assumption that the enemy's main fire will fall where the fighting is thickest. But Anzio did not offer that kind of distance. The beachhead was too tight. The roads were too exposed. The German guns had too many chances. Tents went up because they had to. Surgical teams needed space. Nurses needed wards. Ambulances needed places to unload. Men with abdominal wounds could not be bounced endlessly over cratered roads. Men in shock could not wait for perfect conditions. The wounded were coming, and the medical system had to receive them, whether the ground was safe or not. So the hospital area near Nettuno grew under the same sky that German observers were watching. Canvas, poles, cots, operating tables, supply crates, sterilizers, plasma bottles, sandbags. Everything necessary to keep men alive. Everything fragile. The soldiers arriving there saw a different war. Some had come from the mud of the line, dazed and gray-faced. Some were carried in from ambulances with blankets pulled to their chins. Some still had enough strength to joke with the nurses, because joking was sometimes the last defense a frightened man had. They saw women moving calmly through the ward and believed, for a moment, that they had crossed some invisible boundary. Here, they thought, the war became medicine. Here, someone would know what to do. And the nurses did know. They knew how to check a pulse without showing alarm. They knew when a man was bleeding too much. They knew the look of shock before the body fully declared it. They knew how to speak to a soldier who was trying not to look at where his leg used to be. They knew how to prepare a patient for surgery when the surgeon had been working too long and the next stretcher was already coming in. But there was something they could not control. The German guns did not respect the emotional boundary between battlefield and hospital. The shells reached supply areas. They reached roads. They reached tents. They reached men who had already been marked as casualties and carried away from combat. The Allied plan had believed in a breakout. What really happened was compression. Everything was too close. The front, the rear, the roads, the hospitals, the sea. The geography of Anzio turned the medical chain into a target not because the nurses had chosen danger, but because danger had run out of places to stop. And as the beachhead hardened into weeks of punishment, one truth became harder to deny. The nurses had not been sent into battle in the old heroic sense. But the battle had come to them, and the system that was supposed to carry wounded men away from danger was about to be tested in a way no clean map had prepared it for. The chain of evacuation. The army did not send a wounded man straight from the battlefield into a hospital bed with white sheets and quiet corridors. That was the image civilians often carried in their minds. A man falls, a medic comes, an ambulance takes him away. Somewhere behind the line, nurses and doctors restore order. The reality was slower, rougher, and more fragile. A wounded soldier entered a chain. First came the moment of injury itself, the dirty, violent second when metal entered flesh, when the body reacted before the mind understood. A man might fall in a field, in a ditch, inside a half-collapsed building, beside a vehicle, or on a road already being swept by machine gun fire. If he could move, he crawled. If he could not, he waited. Then came the aid man, if one could reach him. A bandage, tourniquet, morphine sometimes, a tag. A few words spoken close to the ear because the battlefield was too loud for anything else. From there, stretcher bearers carried him back, often bent low, often slipping in mud, sometimes waiting for shellfire to lift before crossing open ground. Aid station, collecting station, clearing station, field hospital, evacuation hospital, hospital ship, general hospital. Those words sound orderly. They were not. Every step depended on weather, roads, fuel, vehicles, enemy fire, manpower, and time. Especially time. Time was the enemy hidden inside every wound. Bleeding had its own clock. Shock had its own clock. Infection had its own clock. Pain could break a man's strength. Cold could pull life out of him quietly. A delay that looked small on a report could become fatal inside a body. This was the mathematics the nurses learned, not as theory, but through repetition. They knew that survival was often decided after the shell fragment struck, but before the surgeon could finish. They knew that the body could be kept alive long enough for medicine to work, or it could slip away in a crowded ward because no one noticed the pulse weakening under a blanket. The nurse's work began where drama usually stops. After the explosion, after the stretcher, after the first heroic rescue. She met the consequences. A man arrived pale and sweating, saying he was fine when he was not. Another came in silent, which was worse. Some were angry. Some were ashamed of crying. Some clutched letters, photographs, cigarettes, rosaries, lucky coins, pieces of equipment they refused to release. A few asked about friends who had arrived in the same ambulance. The nurse might know the answer and decide not to give it yet. Her job was not simply to comfort. Comfort alone did not stop blood loss. She watched respiration. She checked dressings. She prepared plasma. She changed sheets that were no longer sheets but records of trauma. She kept track of morphine, instruments, temperatures, pulse rates, urine output, shock blankets, surgical schedules, and the small changes in a man's face that told her he was slipping before the chart did. In ordinary medicine, these acts might have belonged to a hospital. In Italy, they belonged to war. The field and evacuation hospitals were designed to turn chaos back into sequence. Triage first. Surgery where needed. Stabilization. Evacuation. More care farther back. It was a machine made of people, and like every machine in war, it broke where pressure was greatest. Ambulances arrived in clusters. Not one by one, but in waves after an attack. Mud delayed them, then released them all at once. A quiet hour could turn into 50 patients. A surgical team might work until exhaustion made simple movements dangerous. A nurse might finish one dressing, turn, and find 3 more men waiting with eyes fixed on her because she was the only sign that someone was still in control. At Anzio, the chain was shortened by geography and strained by fire. The hospital was close enough to receive the wounded quickly. That saved lives. It was also close enough to be shelled. That threatened them again. This was the cruel bargain. The closer a hospital stood to the front, the better its chance of saving a man who would die from delay. But closeness also meant exposure. German artillery did not need to see every tent clearly. It only had to reach the area. Shellfire did not distinguish between a man who had just fired a rifle and a man who had just been opened on an operating table. What they believed was that evacuation moved men away from danger. What really happened at Anzio was that danger followed the chain backward. And when the chain shook, the nurses became its human joints. They absorbed panic. They made decisions before orders arrived. They kept bodies warm, wounds covered, plasma flowing, and men still enough not to tear themselves apart. They worked in a war that gave them responsibility faster than it gave them recognition. But there was a deeper problem still hidden inside the hospital tents. The medical system could be trained for blood, could be trained for wounds, could even be trained for mass casualties. But it had not truly been built for the moment when the ward itself came under fire, when patients who could not stand had to be protected from shells falling onto their beds. And at Anzio, that moment was no longer theoretical. Women the army needed but did not fully see. Before the war, many of the women who would become army nurses had worked in places that smelled of soap, alcohol, boiled linen, and long night shifts. They came from civilian hospitals, training schools, city wards, small towns, Catholic institutions, public clinics, private duty rooms. They had learned discipline before they entered the army. Nursing had already taught them fatigue, hierarchy, blood, impatience, and the strange intimacy of caring for strangers at their weakest moments. But military service added something else. It gave them uniforms, orders, overseas deployment, blackout rules, helmets, gas masks, inoculations, and the knowledge that a hospital could be packed into crates and shipped toward a war. The army needed them. That part was never in doubt for long. By the time the United States was fully engaged in World War II, the demand for nurses grew with every theater, every campaign, every landing, every offensive. Men could be trained to fight, but once wounded, they needed a different kind of skill around them. Doctors could operate, but surgery was only one part of survival. A ward without nurses was a room full of bodies waiting for deterioration. Still, need did not automatically become respect. The army was a male institution, built around command, rank, combat arms, movement, and force. It understood infantrymen. It understood artillerymen. It understood pilots and sailors and tank crews. Nurses occupied a more uncomfortable place in the military imagination. They were essential, but not quite allowed to belong to the story of battle. They were close to suffering, but not meant to be close to danger. They were disciplined, but often treated as if their discipline was softer. They were officers in function before they were fully understood as military professionals. The public image did not help. Recruiting posters could make nursing look clean, noble, almost graceful. A woman in a neat uniform looking upward toward duty. Promise of service. Patriotic smile. Nothing in those posters captured the weight of a soaked blanket, the smell of an infected wound, the sound a young soldier made when he understood his leg was gone, or the way artillery made the hands move faster while the face stayed calm. At Anzio, there was no room for the poster. There were only women working in conditions that would have stripped away any sentimental idea of service within hours. They slept when they could. They ate quickly. They learned the rhythm of incoming patients by listening to the roads. They could tell when ambulances were arriving before anyone officially announced it. They could tell when a surgeon was too tired. They could tell when a patient was trying to be brave for them, and when he was too frightened to pretend. The men often saw them before they saw the doctors. A nurse might be the first steady face after transport. She might be the person who cut away a sleeve, loosened a boot, checked a dressing, whispered that the surgeon was coming. For a soldier who had spent hours under fire, that voice mattered. Not because it promised survival. Could not. But because it suggested that the world had not completely broken. And yet, outside the hospital, many still believed the real war was elsewhere. The real war was on the line. In the guns. In the tanks. In the cockpits. In the command posts. That belief contained some truth. but only some. Because war is not made only by the act of killing. It is also made by the effort to keep the wounded alive afterward. An army that cannot treat its wounded loses more than men. It loses morale. It loses confidence. It loses the invisible agreement that if a soldier falls, someone will try to bring him back. The nurses helped hold that agreement together. They were not superhuman. They were not untouched by fear. They flinched when shells landed. They got tired. They made mistakes. They carried memories home that did not fit neatly into victory speeches. The point is not that they did not fear the war. The point is that fear did not excuse them from the work. At Anzio, the old categories began to fail. Combatant and non-combatant. Front and rear. Safe and unsafe. Men who fought and women who cared. The battlefield did not respect those divisions. When shells landed near the wards, the question was not whether a nurse had been meant for combat. The question was whether she could keep a wounded man from tearing open his stitches while the ground shook under him. That was the hidden truth the army was slow to see. The nurses had always been part of survival. Anzio merely made it impossible to deny. But even then, the hardest test was still ahead. Because courage in a hospital does not always look like advancing under fire. Sometimes it looks like refusing to leave a man who cannot move, even when every instinct in the body is telling you to get down. And soon, that instinct would meet its moment. Hell's half-acre. The hospital area near Anzio did not look like a place where men were supposed to recover. It looked like something temporary trying to pretend it was permanent. Tents stood on scraped ground. Sandbags pressed against canvas walls. Wooden planks lay in walkways that turned slick after rain. Ambulances came in with mud across their tires and blood inside their doors. Crates of medical supplies sat beside fuel cans, stretchers, helmets, folded blankets, and the ordinary debris of an army forced to live too close together. The sea was not far away. That should have been comforting. Ships meant evacuation, supplies, power behind the landing. But at Anzio, the sea also reminded everyone that there was no easy way out. Behind them was water. Ahead was the German line. Above them was the sound of aircraft. Somewhere inland were guns with the range to reach almost anything inside the beachhead. Men gave names to things that frightened them. One of the German long-range guns became known by names like the Anzio Express or Whistling Willie. The names almost sound playful until you imagine waiting for the sound. A distant report. A rising scream. Then the instinctive calculation no one wanted to make. Is it passing over? Or is it coming here? The hospitals adapted because they had no other choice. Tents were dug in where possible. Sandbags were stacked higher. Patients were placed lower. Staff learned to move during lulls and freeze during incoming fire. Blackout discipline turned light into a controlled substance. A lamp could help a surgeon see, but it could also betray a position. A flashlight became both tool and risk. A cigarette ember had to be hidden. A tent flap opened at the wrong moment could leak brightness into the night. The ward smelled of damp earth, iodine, canvas, sweat, tobacco, blood, and the faint chemical sharpness of sterilized instruments. The sounds came in layers. Men breathing, men muttering in sleep, nurses walking between cots, trucks outside, distant guns, closer guns, the small click of something being prepared, the low voice of a doctor asking for a clamp, rain striking canvas. Then, sometimes, the whole world interrupted by artillery. This was where the belief in the rear finally collapsed. At Anzio, rear was not a place. It was a hope. The German army understood pressure. It understood that a beachhead could be squeezed not only by attacking its front but by making every inch behind that front unstable. Shell the roads and movement slows. Shell supply points and ammunition becomes harder to distribute. Shell the hospital area, and fear spreads backward into the wounded, the staff, the men who believed evacuation meant escape. Not every shell that struck near a hospital was necessarily aimed at a cot or an operating table. War is often less precise and more terrible than intention. But the result did not depend on intention. A fragment that entered a tent did not ask what kind of target it had found. For the nurses, this produced a strange kind of waiting. They did not wait like infantrymen at the edge of an assault. They waited while working, while changing dressings, while preparing injections, while washing instruments, while trying to make a man drink water, while writing down a temperature. The danger was not an event scheduled on the day's orders. It was part of the air, and this made fatigue worse. Fear you can respond to may sharpen the body. Fear you must live inside dulls it. After enough shelling, a person begins to recognize the pauses between sounds. The body learns to tighten before the mind gives permission. Sleep becomes shallow. The muscles stay ready. The eyes burn. Hands keep working because hands have learned duties the mind no longer has strength to debate. The wounded sensed it too. Even half-conscious men knew when the staff was listening for something. They watched faces. A nurse who turned her head too quickly could start a ripple of dread through a ward. So nurses learned to control not only treatments, but expressions. Calm became a form of medicine. Not false cheer. Not softness. Something harder. The calm of someone who knows the danger and stays anyway. Hell's half-acre was not hell because every second was explosion. It was hell because no one inside it could fully trust the next second. A patient might survive surgery and die in a shelling. A nurse might finish a shift and be called back because casualties came in faster than anyone expected. A doctor might operate while counting the impacts outside. A medical unit might mark itself clearly and still find that clarity meant little inside artillery range. What they believed was that the hospital existed outside the battle's central violence. What really happened was that the hospital became one of the places where the battle tested the army most brutally. Not with rifles. With continuity. Could the staff continue? Could the wounded remain still? Could surgery go on? Could the ward be kept from dissolving into panic when every canvas wall reminded them how thin protection really was? On February 10th, that question stopped being abstract. The shells came close, then closer, and inside the tents, nurses began making decisions that would later be written in citations, though no citation could fully contain the sound of that afternoon. Do not evacuate the ward. The first instinct under shellfire is older than training. Get low. Find cover. Protect the head. Move away from anything that can tear, burn, collapse, or explode. Every soldier knows this. Every civilian learns it quickly in war. The body understands before the mind forms the words. When the ground jumps and metal screams through the air, the body wants to become smaller. It wants to live. For the nurses at Anzio, that instinct did not disappear. They were not calm because they lacked fear. That would make them something other than human, and they were painfully human. They had nerves, muscles, memory, exhaustion, and the same animal desire to survive as anyone else under fire. But their patience could not follow the instinct. That was the problem. A wounded man fresh from surgery could not dive into a slit trench. A man with abdominal wounds could not roll from a cot without ripping open what the surgeon had just repaired. A patient under anesthesia could not understand danger. A man in shock might try to stand and collapse. A man with a chest wound might panic, fight for air, and worsen the bleeding inside him. So the nurse's instinct had to split in two. One part heard the shells and wanted cover. The other saw the ward. That second part won, not because it was fearless, but because it had work to do. The decision was not romantic. It was practical. Patients had to be lowered from cots to the ground. Blankets had to be pulled over bodies. Dressings had to be protected from dirt. Men had to be told not to move. Blood and plasma lines had to be watched. A man half-conscious from morphine needed someone close enough to stop him from tearing at bandages. The ward had to be made lower, quieter, less exposed, less likely to become a scene of blind movement. In another kind of story, this would be the moment someone gives a speech. There were no speeches. There was only the hard language of emergency. Stay down. Don't move. Help me with him. Hold this. Keep your head low. Words like tools. Small, direct, stripped of everything unnecessary. The forbidden idea was not written as a doctrine. It was not presented to a board. It was not invented in a command meeting. It was simply what the situation demanded. Do not abandon the men who cannot save themselves. To an outside observer, staying inside a ward under shellfire could look irrational. The staff themselves might become casualties. If nurses were killed, the hospital would lose skilled hands it desperately needed. A commander thinking in manpower might argue for shelter first, return second. But the battlefield often destroys neat priorities. If the staff left too soon, patients could die. If patients panicked, more could be lost. If surgical cases were disrupted, the work of hours could be undone in seconds. If the ward became chaos, the hospital would still exist physically but fail in purpose. So the nurses stayed long enough to impose order on the worst moments. Not always standing, sometimes crouched, sometimes moving bent over, sometimes kneeling in mud beside a cot that had become too dangerous to remain a cot. Their helmets did not make them safe. Their uniforms did not make them invisible. The Red Cross markings did not thicken the canvas. Their protection was speed, discipline, and luck. Luck mattered. War always leaves room for luck, which is why its survivors are often careful with the word courage. A shell lands 5 yards farther away, and one person becomes decorated. 5 yards closer, and that person becomes a name on a casualty report. A fragment flies high, and a nurse keeps working. It flies low, and the ward loses the hands everyone was counting on. The difference can be smaller than a breath. The nurses knew this, whether they said it or not. They saw what metal did to flesh. They understood the body's vulnerability more intimately than most soldiers. A combat man might know the danger of a shell through exposure. A nurse knew it through aftermath. She had removed clothing stiff with blood. She had cleaned wounds that looked impossible. She had watched men survive what seemed unsurvivable, and die from injuries that looked, at first, almost manageable. So when shellfire came through a hospital area, she knew exactly what it could do. And still she moved toward the beds. That is where the old belief broke most completely. The belief that nurses belonged behind danger. The belief that their courage was of a gentler category. The belief that medical war was separate from combat war. At Anzio, those beliefs could not survive the sound of artillery striking the hospital grounds. But the most terrible test had not yet arrived as a concept. It arrived as impact, as dust, as lights going out, as men calling from their beds, as nurses deciding in seconds what later generations would need years to properly understand. The ward did not need heroes in that moment. It needed hands. And on February 10th, those hands were still there when the shells came down. The shelling of February 10th. The shelling did not turn the hospital into chaos all at once. Chaos usually begins in pieces. First, a sound from outside that makes everyone pause. Then the impact. Then dirt and canvas moving. Then someone realizing a line has gone dead, or a light has gone out, or a man who had been quiet is suddenly trying to climb from his cot. In the hospital area near Anzio on February 10, 1944, the difference between order and disaster became frighteningly thin. German artillery began falling close enough to strike the medical installations. The force of it moved through the ground, through tent poles, through the bodies of men already weakened by wounds. Canvas offered almost no protection. Sandbags helped where they had been placed, but fragments had a way of finding gaps. A hospital is full of hard surfaces that can become secondary dangers. Metal trays, glass, splintering wood, equipment knocked loose by blast. In one ward, patients had to be lowered to the ground. Think of what that means. Not a simple movement. Not a comm transfer. A nurse and another staff member beside a surgical patient, trying to lift without tearing stitches, trying to keep a dressing clean, trying not to drop him when the next shell lands. A man groans because the movement hurts. Another asks what is happening though he already knows. Someone tells him to keep still. Outside, the guns continue. In the operating area, surgery could not simply stop. A wounded man under the knife is a different kind of prisoner. He belongs to the table until the surgeon can close what has been opened. If lights fail, someone finds another source. If the tent shakes, hands wait for steadiness and continue. If shellfire hits nearby, every person in the room understands that there are now two battles. One outside the tent, one inside the body. Mary Roberts was among the nurses whose actions at Anzio would later be recognized. So were Rita Rourke and Elaine Rowe. Ellen Ainsworth would become one of the names most closely tied to that day's cost. The citations and records matter because they give history something to hold. But in the moment, these women were not thinking in the language of medals. They were counting patients, controlling fear, moving bodies, making sure wounded men were not wounded again by panic. The shelling reached into the hospital. Nurses were injured. Some medical personnel were killed. The old promise that a hospital marked a boundary had been violated not necessarily as a clean act of intention, but as battlefield reality. The German artillery did what artillery does. It made distance meaningless. It reduced canvas, rank, gender, profession, and medical status to the same exposure. For the men in the ward, the psychological wound was sharp. Many had held on through combat by imagining the next point in the evacuation chain. Just reach the aid station. Just reach the ambulance. Just reach the hospital. Each step had been a kind of bargain with fear. But now, lying on cots, they heard the same war outside the tent that they had thought they had left behind. A nurse walking between them became more than staff. She became proof that the room had not surrendered. That matters. In battle, panic is not only noise. Panic changes outcomes. A patient who moves can bleed. A patient who fights restraint can undo surgery. A ward that loses command can lose minutes, and minutes are blood. By keeping the patients down, by speaking firmly, by moving from cot to cot, nurses prevented the shelling from becoming a second massacre inside the hospital. Still, there were losses. The documentary should not pass over them too quickly. A nurse killed in a hospital is not a symbol first. She is a person whose work stopped in mid-motion. Someone who had been expected on the next shift. Someone whose belongings remained somewhere. Someone whose absence would be felt not only by family far away but by the staff who had to continue with one fewer pair of trained hands. That is one of the hardest truths of wartime medicine. Grief could not be given the space it deserved. The wounded kept coming. Dressings still needed changing. Instruments still needed cleaning. Patients still asked questions. The staff could not collapse around the dead because the living had immediate claims on them. So grief was postponed, folded into silence, carried under the next task. When the shelling eased, the hospital did not look like victory. It looked damaged, exhausted, and still working. There were holes in canvas, equipment displaced, dirt where dirt should not be, men on the ground who had been on cots. Nurses checking them again one by one because after shellfire every patient had to be accounted for. Was he hit? Was the dressing still secure? Was the breathing worse? Was the pulse weaker? Who needed surgery now? Who had died? Who could still be saved? This was the battlefield reality. The German shells had reached the hospital, but they had not stopped the hospital. That distinction was everything. Because an army does not survive merely by avoiding damage. No army does. It survives by continuing to function after damage arrives. At Anzio, the nurses became part of that continuation. They did not defeat artillery. They did not silence the guns. They did something less visible and more intimate. They kept the wounded from being abandoned by order. The army would later recognize some of them with the Silver Star. Records would preserve their names. But records cannot fully capture the small physical facts. The weight of a patient's shoulder, the taste of dust, the shock in a man's eyes when he realized the nurse had stayed, the way silence after shellfire felt less like peace than waiting. And when the hospital began counting the living, another truth emerged. The difference between survival and death had not been decided only on the battlefield. It had been decided in the ward, in minutes, by people the war had once imagined were far behind it. The mathematics of survival. A battlefield wound is not one event. It is a sequence. The shell explodes. The fragment strikes. The body opens. Blood begins to leave the system. Pain floods the mind. Shock starts its quiet work. Cold enters. Infection waits. Breathing changes. The heart compensates, then struggles. A man who looks alive may already be moving toward death unless someone interrupts the sequence. That interruption was the real work of wartime medicine. Not magic. Not sentiment. Interruption. A bandage interrupts bleeding. Plasma interrupts collapse. Warmth interrupts shock. Surgery interrupts internal damage. A nurse watching through the night interrupts the moment no one else sees, when a patient who seems stable begins slipping away. This is why numbers matter, but only if they are connected to bodies. World War II medical statistics often show that many wounded soldiers survived if they reached care in time. The exact percentages vary by theater, wound type, and source, and any responsible script should verify final figures before recording. But the broad truth is clear. The medical chain saved a huge number of men who, in earlier wars, would have died from bleeding, shock, infection, delay, or exposure. What matters is not only the number. It is what the number reveals. Survival was built from thousands of small acts repeated under pressure. At Anzio, those acts happened inside a system being shelled. Imagine a ward after a rush of casualties. Not one patient with one nurse in a quiet room. Dozens of men. Some just out of surgery. Some waiting. Some conscious. Some not. A few trying to talk. A few too still. Every bed has its own danger, but no bed exists alone. A nurse has to prioritize constantly. The man calling loudest may not be the one in greatest danger. The silent one may be closer to death. The pale one may need blood. The restless one may be entering shock. The one asking for water may not be allowed to drink before surgery. This is the hidden labor of survival. Judgment. A nurse learns to read the room as much as the chart. She sees a hand tightening on a blanket. She hears a change in breathing. She notices that a patient who had been complaining has stopped. That silence can be more alarming than a cry. She touches a forehead, checks a pulse, calls for help, adjusts a blanket, raises an alarm before the body fully announces its failure. In a documentary about tanks or aircraft, mathematics often means armor thickness, speed, range, bomb load. Here, the mathematics is quieter. How many minutes can a man bleed before the chance narrows? How many patients can one ward absorb before order breaks? How many surgical teams can work before exhaustion increases mistakes? How many seconds does it take for panic to spread when shells land nearby? How many trained nurses can a hospital lose before the burden on the rest becomes dangerous? These questions are not soft. They are operational. A military hospital is part of combat power because it returns men to life and sometimes to duty. It sustains morale because soldiers fight differently when they believe they will not be left in the mud. It protects the army from the full cost of its own violence. When that system holds, casualties remain tragedies. When it breaks, casualties become collapse. The nurses were inside that equation. Often, their work did not produce a dramatic moment. A man lived because his bleeding was checked, because his temperature was watched, because his dressings were changed, because he was kept from moving during shellfire, because someone noticed his breathing was wrong at 2 o'clock in the morning. These things rarely become legends. They are too practical, too repetitive, too easy to mistake for ordinary care. But in war, ordinary care under extraordinary conditions becomes decisive. At Anzio, artillery tried to convert the hospital from a system of survival into a scene of disorder. The nurses resisted not by force, but by keeping the sequence intact. Patient after patient, task after task, breath after breath. The Germans believed, as any army might, that shelling a crowded beachhead could disrupt everything within it. Roads, supplies, morale, command, medical function. They were not wrong. But what really happened was more complicated. The shells disrupted the hospitals. They killed and wounded staff. They terrified patients. They damaged equipment. Yet they did not erase the discipline inside the wards. The medical staff absorbed the blow and continued. That continuation changed outcomes. A man who might have died from panic-induced movement did not. A man who might have slipped into shock was noticed. A surgical patient survived the interruption. A ward that could have dissolved into screaming retained enough order to function. This is the kind of battlefield reality that rarely appears in the large arrows of campaign maps. But it matters, because the road to Rome was not paved only by infantry advances and artillery barrages. It was also paved by the survival of men who had already been hit, men whose lives depended on a hospital system that had to function while the battlefield tried to break it. And yet, every number has a shadow. For every man saved, someone had to carry the memory of saving him, or failing to, or saving him while the person in the next cot died, or returning to duty after a fellow nurse was killed because there were still patients waiting. The mathematics of survival can explain the importance of the work, cannot measure what the work cost. That cost lived in the people who woke up alive, and in the women who had watched them through the worst hours of the war. The men who woke up alive. Some men woke in the hospital and did not know where they were. That was common. The mind, coming back through pain and morphine, does not always return in order. A soldier might hear canvas shifting in the wind and think it was artillery again. He might smell antiseptic and blood and not understand why he was not still in the field. He might try to sit up because the last thing he remembered was falling, and falling in combat meant you had to move before someone found your range. Then a nurse would put a hand on his shoulder. Not a grand gesture, just enough pressure to bring him back into the room. You're all right. Stay still. All right did not mean whole. It did not mean safe forever. It meant alive in that second, and sometimes that was the only truth a man could hold. For many wounded soldiers, nurses became the first human sign that the war had changed shape. The front had been noise, dirt, orders, fear, and impact. The hospital was pain, light, waiting, and voices. The danger had not vanished, but it had become something that could be answered with hands. A nurse might cut away a uniform stiff with dried mud. She might find a letter in a pocket and place it somewhere it would not be lost. She might remove a boot from a swollen foot, clean dirt from around a wound, or hold a cup to a man's mouth when his hands shook too badly to manage it himself. She might also lie. Not cruelly, carefully. A soldier might ask if his friend made it. She might know he had not, but the man asking might be minutes from surgery, his pulse already weak, his body fighting to remain in the world. Truth could wait. Survival could not. War forces that kind of mercy on people. The nurses did not only treat wounds. They managed terror. A young soldier facing amputation did not need a lecture. He needed someone who would not look away. A man burned in a vehicle did not need pity. He needed precision, gentleness, and a voice steady enough to keep him from disappearing into panic. A dying man might need water he could not have, or a letter written, or simply another human being close enough that he did not leave the world alone. The emotional labor was not separate from the medical labor. It was part of it. A frightened patient fights treatment. A panicked patient moves when he must not. A man who believes no one is in control loses the last discipline his body has. Nurses understood this. They had to. A ward was not only a collection of injuries. It was a field of human reactions. Fear moved through it like smoke. At Anzio, after shelling, that fear was sharper. The men had learned that even the hospital could be hit. The bed did not guarantee escape. The tent did not promise distance. The presence of nurses did not stop artillery. But it did something else. Kept the men from facing the truth alone. That is why the forgotten part of this story is not only that nurses were brave. It is that they became witnesses to forms of suffering the official language of war often flattened. A casualty report might say wounded in action. Severe. Moderate. Returned to duty. Died of wounds. A nurse saw the person before the category hardened around him. She saw the soldier who kept apologizing because his blood had soaked the blanket. She saw the man who asked her not to tell his mother he had cried. She saw the one who joked until the surgeon approached, then went quiet. She saw the patient who survived the operation but could not stop asking whether his hands were still there. She saw men who had been trained to obey orders reduced to asking strangers for permission to hope. And then, when one patient was moved out, another came in. This repetition created a particular kind of burden. In combat, a soldier might measure a day by ground taken or held. In a hospital, a nurse measured it by beds emptied, beds filled, dressings changed, temperatures recorded, men saved, men lost. There was no clean victory. A ward could have a good day and still contain death. A nurse could do everything correctly and still lose the patient. She could save one man and remember the face of the one she could not reach in time. The men who woke up alive often carried fragments of memory. A voice, a helmet, a hand, a lamp, a woman telling him not to move while the guns were firing. Years later, some veterans remembered nurses with a clarity they did not give to officers. That makes sense. In the moment when a man is stripped of rank, weapon, and control, he remembers who stayed close. But the nurses themselves often moved on without ceremony. There was always another patient, another convoy, another operation, another shelling, another night when sleep came late or not at all. Their grief had to be quiet because the ward had no space for theatrical sorrow. The war kept demanding function. That is why medals, when they came, could only tell part of the truth. Recognition could name an act. It could not name the 1,000 smaller acts around it. And it could not answer the question that followed Anzio into the records of the war. If these women had been so essential under fire, why would so many of their stories later fade behind the louder machinery of battle? The medals came late, then the work continued. A medal citation has a particular sound. Formal, compressed, controlled. It takes panic, dust, blood, fear, and decision, then turns them into sentences. It names courage without fully showing the trembling hand. It records action but rarely captures exhaustion. It preserves history, but only after history has been made survivable for paper. After Anzio, several army nurses received the Silver Star for their actions under fire. Mary Roberts, Rita Rourke, Elaine Rowe, Ellen Ainsworth, whose story carried the additional weight of sacrifice. The awards mattered. They mattered because institutions remember through documents, and documents shape what later generations are allowed to notice. They mattered because women in uniform had done something the old imagination of war had not made enough room for. They mattered because the army, which had sometimes treated nurses as necessary but secondary, had to acknowledge that under shellfire these women had displayed battlefield courage. But the medals did not end the work. That is the part worth lingering on. A nurse could be decorated and then return to duty. The next patient did not care that history had paused to recognize someone. The next wound did not wait for ceremony. The next artillery barrage did not avoid the hospital because citations had been typed. The war remained indifferent to honor. This gives the recognition a strange sadness. The nurse stands for a moment in official light, then goes back into the tent. The public version of courage often ends with applause. The wartime version often ends with another shift. For Roberts, Rourke, Rowe, Ainsworth, and others like them, the meaning of the medal was not that they had become larger than the people around them. It was that the people around them had briefly become visible through them. A decorated nurse represented not only herself but a whole profession whose daily courage was too constant to be individually recorded. That is why the documentary should resist the easy shape of hero worship. These nurses were not comic book figures. They were trained professionals under pressure. They acted because the patients needed them, because the ward had to hold, because someone had to lower the men to the ground and keep track of who was still breathing. Their courage was not separate from competence. It was competence refusing to leave. The Army's delayed realization was not instant transformation. Military culture changes slowly. The war expanded the roles of women, but it did not erase old assumptions. Nurses served across theaters, endured danger, handled mass casualties, and still often returned to a country more comfortable praising them as angels than recognizing them as military professionals. Angel is a dangerous word. It sounds kind. It also removes the dirt. An angel does not sweat through a uniform. An angel does not make triage decisions. An angel does not work with cracked hands, blood under the nails, and a body so tired that sleep feels like falling through a floor. An angel is not angry when supplies are late or afraid when artillery walks closer. An angel does not carry the smell of a hospital tent in memory for the rest of her life. The nurses were not angels. They were women doing brutal, skilled work under conditions that would have broken many people who later called them gentle. This distinction matters for the tone of the film. Respect does not require exaggeration. It requires accuracy. The truth is strong enough, At Anzio, the awards made public what the wounded already knew. The hospital had been held together by people whose names were often absent from the main campaign narratives. When German shells hit the hospital area, the official categories failed. These were non-combatants in a combat zone, medical personnel under fire, women in a war that had not fully prepared itself to describe their courage. And then there were the forgotten ones, the nurses who did not receive medals, the orderlies, the doctors, the ambulance drivers, the enlisted medical staff, the patients who helped other patients despite their own wounds, the men who died before anyone could learn their names properly, the people whose service appears only as a number in a unit history, if at all. War memory is selective not always because people are cruel, but because memory follows noise. Tanks are loud. Bombers are visible. Generals leave papers. Battles have names. A nurse checking a pulse in the dark leaves less evidence, even when that pulse continues because of her. That is why recognition came late for so many, and why it still feels incomplete. The medals at Anzio should not be treated as the end of the story. They are a doorway. They lead from one hospital area in Italy to a much larger truth about World War II. Nurses were everywhere the wounded went, and the wounded went everywhere the war reached. From Italy to France. From the Pacific to hospital ships. From air evacuation to winter wards near the Bulge. The story widened. And with it, the old belief became harder and harder to defend. The nurses had never been behind the war. They had been moving through its aftermath all along. From Anzio to Normandy to the Bulge. Anzio was not an exception because nurses were under pressure. It was an exception because the pressure became impossible to ignore. Across World War II, nurses served wherever the medical chain needed them. That meant places far from combat, yes, but also places close enough to hear it, smell it, and receive its consequences while the guns were still firing. They worked in evacuation hospitals, field hospitals, station hospitals, hospital ships, hospital trains, transport aircraft, and improvised wards that existed only because men were being wounded faster than buildings could be prepared. The public memory of World War II often moves from battle to battle. Pearl Harbor, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Bulge, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But the nurses experienced the war through another geography. Routes of evacuation, surgical loads, weather, infection, blood supply, distance from the front, the condition of roads, the number of ambulances, the number of beds, the number of men who arrived before anyone had slept. In Normandy, after June 6, 1944, the wounded came through a landscape still being fought over. The beaches became ports, roads, cemeteries, supply corridors, and evacuation routes all at once. The same pattern returned. What planners designed as a chain became, in practice, a living thing stretched by mud, shelling, traffic, and exhaustion. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, cold became its own enemy. A wounded man in winter does not only bleed. He freezes. Shock deepens in the cold. Fingers stiffen. Blankets matter. Warmth becomes treatment. Nurses worked in conditions where snow, darkness, overcrowding, and sudden casualty surges turned every hour into triage. The enemy was not only German fire. It was delay, exposure, confusion, roads blocked by weather and war. In the Pacific, distance and disease added different burdens. Heat, humidity, malaria, jungle rot, long evacuation routes, and the vastness of ocean changed the medical war. Hospital ships carried men away from islands whose names became shorthand for suffering. Flight nurses turned aircraft into moving wards, caring for wounded men above water and jungle, where turbulence could become another kind of battlefield. Each theater changed the details. The central truth remained. The closer modern war brought medical care to the front, the more nurses became part of the operational reality of battle. What they believed, in the older imagination, was that combat ended and care began. What really happened was that care had to enter the combat zone's shadow to save men before time killed them. That truth reshaped medicine. It strengthened evacuation systems. It proved the value of trained nursing under military conditions. It showed that survival depended not on one heroic intervention but on a chain of competence. From the aid man in the mud to the surgeon at the table to the nurse watching the patient at 3 in the morning. Yet memory still lagged. Many veterans remembered nurses personally. They remembered faces, voices, accents, hands. But public history often kept them at the edges. Nurses appeared in photographs, sometimes smiling, sometimes standing beside rows of beds. But the captions rarely carried the full weight of what they had done. They were described as caring, devoted, tireless. All true, all insufficient, because the word caring can be made too soft. At the front, care could be hard, fast, technical, and unsentimental. A nurse might have to hold a man down to save him. She might have to ignore one cry because another patient was closer to death. She might have to prepare a soldier for surgery knowing he did not understand how little time he had. She might have to keep working after learning that a friend had been killed. That kind of care is not softness. It is discipline under emotional fire. And for the soldiers, it mattered in ways difficult to quantify. An army asks men to enter danger. In return, it must offer more than orders. It must offer the belief that if they fall, they will not be discarded. The nurses helped make that belief credible. This is part of combat power that does not fit easily into weapon charts. A tank can advance because fuel reached it. A battalion can hold because ammunition arrived. A wounded soldier can survive because a nurse noticed what others missed. Logistics, medicine, morale. These are the hidden structures beneath battlefield action. When they hold, armies endure. When they fail, courage alone becomes insufficient. Anzio gave this truth a violent clarity. The German shells hit the hospitals, and the medical staff kept functioning. That image should sit at the center of the film even as the story widens beyond Italy. Because it contains the whole contradiction of the war for nurses. They were not sent to kill, but they were placed where killing delivered its results. They did not carry weapons, but they stood inside the reach of weapons. They were described as behind the line, but the line kept moving through them. So why were they forgotten? Partly because survival leaves less dramatic evidence than destruction. A bridge blown up demands attention. A tank knocked out leaves a photograph. A city in ruins becomes a symbol. But a man who lives because his shock was treated in time may simply go home, carrying the evidence in his body and memory. The nurse disappears into that survival. Her success is that the man has a future. And that is why the story must return to the tent, to the afternoon, to the small details that history almost loses. The shaking lamp, the lowered cot, the voice telling a wounded man not to move. Because there, in those details, the old belief finally breaks. And the final truth of the story can be spoken plainly. What they believed, what really happened, returned to the hospital tent at Anzio, not as a battlefield attraction, not as a legend polished by time. Return to it as it was. Canvas, mud, blood, dim light, tired hands, and men lying low because the sky outside could still send metal through the ward. The shelling has eased. That does not mean peace. After artillery, silence has a different texture. It is not empty. It is full of listening. People wait to learn whether the guns are finished or only adjusting. Dust drifts down from the tent seams. Somewhere, a patient coughs. Somewhere else, a nurse asks for a name and receives no answer. Boots move carefully now because there may be glass, splinters, or blood on the ground. The ward must be counted back into existence. One patient, then another, still breathing, dressing loose, pulse weak, needs evacuation, needs surgeon, needs blanket, needs morphine, needs someone to sit beside him for 1 minute longer. This is how a hospital survives being shelled. Not by becoming fearless, by returning to sequence. The war wanted to turn everything into interruption. The nurses turned interruption back into care. That is the heart of the story. World War II is often remembered through machines and movements. Armies crossing borders, bombers over cities, tanks in snow, ships burning in black water, men raising flags, generals signing documents. These images matter. They show the scale of the war. But scale can hide intimacy, and war is finally experienced by the body. A body in a landing craft, A body in a foxhole. A body in a cockpit. A body on a stretcher. A body under a blanket in a field hospital while German shells fall close enough to shake the instruments. The nurses lived in that final space. They met the body after the battle had done its work. They met the cost that strategy created. They could not undo the shell, the mine, the bullet, the burn. They could only fight what came next. Bleeding, shock, infection, cold, fear, despair. Sometimes they won. Sometimes they did not. The honest documentary must leave room for both. It must not turn every patient into a saved life, or every nurse into a saint, or every terrible day into triumph. That would make the story smaller, not larger. The truth is heavier. The nurses worked in a world where skill did not guarantee survival, where courage did not stop artillery, where the best care could still end in death. And still they worked. That is what gives the story its weight. They were forgotten not because they mattered little, but because their victories often left quietly. A man lived and was moved to another hospital. A man recovered enough to write home. A man returned years later to a family that might never know the name of the nurse who watched him through the night. Survival walked away, and with it went part of the evidence. But the evidence is still there if we know where to look. In citations from Anzio, in hospital unit records, in veterans' memories, in photographs of nurses whose faces show exhaustion behind composure, in the growth of military medicine after the war, in the simple fact that thousands of wounded men did not die where they might have died in an earlier age. The German shells that struck near the field hospitals revealed something neither side could fully control. They revealed that modern war had erased the comfortable distance between fighting and healing. The battlefield no longer ended at the trench, the road, or the aid station. It extended into the ward, into surgery, into the recovery tent, into the mind of a wounded man who thought he had reached safety. And when that happened, the nurses became part of the front in a way few people had expected. Not the front of attack, the front of survival. They believed nurses were behind the war. But what really happened was that the war came through the hospital canvas, and the nurses held the line between the wounded and the dark. At 3:15 in the afternoon, near Anzio, a shell could make the whole tent move like it had taken a breath. A man on a cot could hear the world breaking again. And beside him, in the dust and dim light, a nurse could place one hand on his shoulder and tell him, quietly, to stay still. Not because everything was safe, because he was still alive. And in war, sometimes that is the only victory that can be won in a single minute. If you are watching from a place where someone in your family served, healed, carried, nursed, waited, or never came home, share where you are watching from in the comments. Stories like this survive because people choose to remember more than the battles and the generals. If this documentary gave you a different view of World War II, share it with someone who values the forgotten human side of history, and subscribe to WW2 Warfront for more stories of what they believed and what really happened.